Okay, so we're at C8 of the France-Germany talk, and our eighth landmark is the high point, if you like, of the Franco-German project and the high point of the European integration project. That is the sequence which begins with the Single European Act, creating a single European market by eliminating non-tariff barriers, a project rather unusually which originated in the United Kingdom, and then, of course, the Maastricht Treaty. The Maastricht Treaty, as the notes that I've given you suggest, develops Europe really from a very economic project into something a great deal more political. It establishes this three-pillar architecture, the existing economic community, but also cooperation in justice and home affairs and in a foreign and security policy. Of course, it also sets most of the European countries, the British secure an opt-out, on the road to a single currency in the shape of the euro. The Germans have always been fairly comfortable about the political union of Europe, rather more comfortable perhaps than the French. But the French were rather more anxious than the Germans to seek economic and monetary union. Why? Because in the continuing currency instability, because the European monetary system contained but did not halt monetary instability, in the continuing monetary instability of the 1980s, it's effectively Germany's Bundesbank that is setting interest rates for the whole of Europe, but only with German interests in mind. And so for the French, the idea of economic and monetary union was, if you have a single currency, then firstly, you'll put an end to the monetary instability. And secondly, if you've got a European, not a German central bank, then hopefully interest rates will be set by a range of European bankers and not just to suit Germany. As these matters are being discussed as a sort of add-on, a means to further the European project after the agreement of the Single European Act, there's the sudden opportunity of German unification. And this really raises the stakes quite a lot. The Germans now seek political union partly to reassure their European partners that a Germany with the East added onto it, and therefore a country that's going to be much the biggest country in the European communities, can still be relied on, can still be contained within a European framework. And they're prepared to accept, although they're not very keen on economic and monetary union, they're prepared to accept that sacrifice, to give up the Deutschmark, this great symbol of West Germany's post-war economic success. They're prepared to give that up and go for the euro with certain safeguards, again, in order to show their European partners that unification isn't going to mean a hegemonic Germany doing what it likes. As Helmut Kohl said, what I want is a European Germany, not a German Europe. So that's the Maastricht Treaty. And France's President François Mitterrand, perhaps unwisely, decides to put it to referendum. And as you can see from the figures, it's very narrowly passed, 50.8%. And that is what I meant when I said this is the high point of European integration, because support for Europe really rather drains away, and even in France, one of the founding member states, after this high year, crucial year of 1992. Our ninth landmark is the Constitutional Treaty of 2004. By 2004, what is now the European Union has accepted into it a large number of new member states. The easy bit was in 1995 when 3 more states came in, Sweden, Austria and Finland. These were fairly easy states to absorb. They're all quite wealthy. They bring the total to 15. Much more challenging are the new member states, primarily in the east, the 3 Baltic republics, the Visegrad countries, that is Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, and Slovakia, as well as Slovenia and the 2 Mediterranean islands of Malta and Cyprus. And the question then arises, well, after all these treaty changes, the Single European Act and Maastricht, and then rather less importantly, Amsterdam and Nice, and after this big enlargement, shouldn't there come an end point in the European Union? Shouldn't Europeans be able to look at this creature and have a clear idea of what it is? And that's behind the idea of a constitutional treaty in 2004. But interestingly, the French and Germans approached it from very, very different angles. It's fairly clear from the speeches of German Foreign Minister Joschka Fischer that the Germans would be quite happy with a Europe rather on the model of the German Federal Republic, with the Commission as the governing body, the Parliament as the legislature, the Council of Ministers effectively as a sort of upper house representing the member states, and of course there'd be a Court of Justice. Whereas the French are rather keen to resist big new transfers of sovereignty. And the result is a rather uneasy and lumbering and cumbersome compromise, which France's President Jacques Chirac is, again, I think rather unwise enough to put to referendum. And this time it's defeated in 2005. May 2005 it's defeated by 54.7% of the vote in France, and that defeat is followed very swiftly afterwards by a defeat in a referendum in the Netherlands. Now, the main provisions of the treaty are then slipped in by Merkozy, by Chancellor Angela Merkel and French President Nicolas Sarkozy, and by their European partners, of course, in 2007. But there isn't the same symbolism surrounding it, the Lisbon Treaty, as it's called, and there are certainly no referendums to ratify it, rather dangerous things. And there's perhaps underlying this a certain sense of unease that maybe the European leaders have gone against the wishes of the French people and the Dutch people as expressed in referendums in 2005. So in 2007, the European Union has a constitution of sorts. It's not really called that anymore. It's called the Lisbon Treaty. And then the following year, there begins another major shock to the world in general and to Europe in particular. That is the financial crisis begun by the subprimes crisis and extending then to the crisis of the euro, which particularly but not exclusively affected Greece. This is C10 in the lecture plan you've got. And the context of this is partly the divergent economic performances of France and Germany. Germany enjoying significantly higher growth by 2010 than France. And reflecting that, significantly different viewpoints on what rapidly becomes a sort of north-south divide between the countries whose debt has exploded as a result of the subprimes crisis, notably Spain, Portugal, Greece, and those northern countries whose economies have fared rather better. And this produces significant stresses in the Franco-German partnership, which are then increased by differences on the matter of refugee policy. Although, by the time we get to 2015-2016, the two countries are at least united on one thing, and that is Brexit. They are disinclined to give the British any special favours, either before or after the referendum of 23rd June 2016. And so we come, C11, to the contemporary Merkel-Macron era. In principle, these two leaders ought to be rather close. Emmanuel Macron is arguably the most pro-European president that France has had since François Mitterrand. He wishes Europe to benefit from Brexit by moving ahead with projects that the British would have done their best to stop. Angela Merkel, on the whole, responds well to Macron's initiatives, except that both leaders are constrained by the domestic situation. Macron, to try and reinforce French competitiveness, imposes a certain number of unpopular economic and social measures, which are then strongly resisted by, notably, demonstrations by the Yellow Vests, Gilets jaunes movement in 2018. While Merkel faces deep unpopularity over her liberal attitude to the refugee question and sees the rise, notably, of the Alternative für Deutschland and a degree of opposition to her rule within her own Christian Democratic Party as well. What these two leaders do manage is, at any rate, a symbolic initiative, the Treaty of Aachen, Aix-la-Chapelle, in 2019, to be precise, on 22nd January 2019, when they sign a treaty based on the 1963 treaty that includes resolutions to reinforce defence cooperation, exchanges of diplomatic personnel, police and justice cooperation on implementing the Paris Climate Change Accords, the creation of a Council of Economic Experts, cooperation on new technological research, and so on. I think it can be said that to do these things, you probably don't need a treaty, and that the treaty itself was a little bit thin on substance. But still, it testifies to these two leaders' strong wish, at any rate, to reinforce a degree of symbolic cooperation. How well that cooperation will survive the current and very serious crisis produced by a little virus, COVID-19, is as yet uncertain. The virus has clearly done very great economic damage, but once again we can see this north-south divide emerging, and Macron rather taking the lead of the southern camp in this by arguing very strongly, notably in an interview with the Financial Times, for mutualization of debt. Angela Merkel, I think, has proved sympathetic to a degree with the plight of countries, especially Italy. If Italy goes down, then really the whole European project is at threat. At the same time, Angela Merkel is constrained by fiscal conservatives within Germany. At the moment, it looks as if she's prepared to have a rescue package. She's prepared to talk about much larger European budgets than before, which is a major shift on what was thought possible in Germany 2 or 3 months ago. I'm talking to you in May 2020. But it still does not amount to the sort of mutualisation of debt, the euro bonds, the $1 trillion package that Macron would like to see. It's very much an open question what's going to happen next on this, and the stakes could hardly be greater. That's the end of Part C. Part D coming up.